All right, let us get today's session going. Welcome, everyone, to the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we are excited to be focusing on a long-awaited and just published book. Actually, the official release date is in 10 days, at least according to that little website, Amazon, a book entitled To Run the World, The Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power. Published by Cambridge University Press, the author, Sergey Radchenko of Johns Hopkins, is no stranger to the Wilson Center or the Washington History Seminar. And no stranger as well are both of our discussants this afternoon, Svetlana Savranskaya and William Taubman. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar with my colleague Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. As many of you know, for well over a decade, the seminar has been a collaborative and nonpartisan initiative of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. A couple of quick things before we get started. Today's session is being co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project and its Kennan Institute. Second, as always, we like to recognize two people whose hard work behind the scenes make these seminars possible: Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. On the logistics front, today's session is being recorded. It can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function on the Q&A on Zoom. We'll call on as many folks as we can. Lastly, this is the penultimate session of the winter-spring 2024 season. You'll be getting, in the nearish future, the schedule for an exciting fall 2024 session. However, we do have a not on Monday session coming up. So mark your calendars. It'll be in the chat function for you to see. On Tuesday, June 11th, from 9:30 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern Time, on the 5th floor of the Wilson Center, Zhou Enlai, A Life will be discussed. This will also be a hybrid session. You'll be receiving a notice. And with that, we can get the seminar fully underway. Christian Osterman will be introducing our speakers and moderating our discussion. Christian, over to you.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon or good evening from here in Budapest. I'm delighted to welcome our three speakers. I'll introduce them in turn. Once Sergey lays out or gives us a survey over his book and his findings, I'll turn to Professor Bill Taubman for his comments and some questions to Sergey. He will engage him with some questions, I hope. Then turn it over to Svetlana, who will make her comments and then engage Sergey with questions before we then go to all of our viewers for more comments and questions involving all of you. With that, really delighted to introduce Sergey Radchenko, who is the Wilson E. Schmidt Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He has written extensively on the Cold War, nuclear history, and on Russian and Chinese foreign and security policies. He has served as a Global Fellow and as a Public Policy Fellow and as a Wilson Center Senior Fellow at the Wilson Center, and has also been a distinguished professor at East China Normal University in Shanghai. His books include To Run the World, The Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power, the book we will be talking about today, of course, but also Two Suns in the Heavens, The Sino-Soviet Struggle for Supremacy, published in 2009, and Unwanted Visionaries, The Soviet Failure in Asia, published in 2014. Sergey is a native of Sakhalin Island, Russia, was educated in the US, Hong Kong, and the UK, where he received his PhD in 2005 from the LSE. Before he joined SAIS, Dr. Radchenko worked and lived in Mongolia, China, and Wales. Sergey is a frequent contributor to the Cold War National History Project and its digital archive. Many of our Russian document collections have reached us from the Russian archives through Sergey, and he's been just fantastic about sharing all of these records with the larger scholarly community. We're finally here to talk about his book, so I'm delighted to give you, Sergey, the floor. Welcome back to the Washington History Seminar. Over to you, Sergey.
Thank you, Christian. It's such a joy to be in the company of old friends. I have talked about this book on a number of occasions, but I have not yet talked about it surrounded by people whom I have known for the better part of last 20 years, 25, something like that, a long time, Christian. We go back quite a while. I also wanted to recognize that it was during my fellowship at the Wilson Center a couple of years ago. In fact, it was during COVID that I wrote large sections of this book. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity that was given to me at that time to be a public policy fellow with the Wilson Center. It was a fantastic opportunity, despite it being in the middle of COVID, and but on the other hand, I had an opportunity to write, maybe less to talk to people. All of that being said, here's the product of all of this work. It's right here. The book has arrived. It is available. Can be purchased of Amazon, and I got my copy, so I'm very thrilled about this. A book about effectively, well, it's a history of the Cold War, but really it is about Soviet approach to the Cold War, as well as Chinese approach to the Cold War. The Soviet Union and China are truly at the center of this narrative. Of course, the United States, as the third major player, is also present. But I think the key contributions that I do make are in the spheres of Soviet and Chinese foreign policy. And the interesting thing about this book as well is that it goes well beyond, in the epilogue, beyond the Cold War itself, and I take it all the way to the present, and I did try to highlight some of the continuities between the Cold War and the post-Cold War, which actually is a major point of this book. So in order to explain what I mean here, let us go back to the end of the Cold War as we knew it, perhaps 1989, perhaps 1991, depending on your end point. You could argue that the fall of the Berlin Wall was when the Cold War ended, or perhaps when the Soviet Union collapsed. Regardless, there was a period in the 1990s slipping over into 2000s when we regarded the Cold War as something that was truly and finally in the past. It was something that happened. It was something that was unique. It was something that we experienced in our lifetime, and it was something that we never expected to come back in any shape or form. Well, increasingly today, for a variety of reasons, people are again resorting to the tropes of the Cold War, to the point of already talking about a second Cold War emerging. Now, of course, there are various arguments about this, and we can argue for a long time whether what we're witnessing today in Sino-American relations it resembles the Cold War and in which ways. But in any case, the intellectual atmosphere has certainly changed, and historians write reflecting sometimes the geist of their times. And I think I did that with this book as well, being truly a post-Cold War historian, but now really returning back, going back to the Cold War and trying to understand whether we may have missed something in the motivations of the Kremlin when we were writing about the Cold War in the past. And so this is what really brings me to the core argument of this book, which is this emphasis on the question of legitimacy and recognition. Of course, legitimacy is brought about through recognition. Let me explain. So basically, power is never enough by itself, I argue in the book. Power has to be recognized as legitimate to be enjoyed. And the Soviet leaders throughout the Cold War, of course, they wanted power. Of course, they also worried about security, and I talk about all of those aspects, but they wanted that power to be recognized as legitimate. They wanted their place in the international order to be recognized. But what was their place? They felt that they deserved to be a superpower. They felt they deserved the title of a great power equal to none except for the United States. And of course, the United States was the key recognizer. American recognition was what made the Soviet Union a true equal of the United States. Without that, it really wasn't. And so the Soviets craved for this kind of recognition. Everybody from Stalin to Nikita Khrushchev to Leonid Brezhnev, and I even argue in a truly revisionist way that even Mikhail Gorbachev was not averse to some of these ideas about recognition of the Soviet Union as a kind of a partner of the United States and running the world. By the way, this title, to run the world, is that just a random thing? Turns out it's not. Comes from a trip that Henry Kissinger undertook to Moscow in the spring of 1973. He was preparing for Leonid Brezhnev's visit to the United States, and Brezhnev took him to his residence outside Moscow in a place called Zavidovo, where they went hunting for boars. Henry Kissinger, never a particularly famous hunter, was perplexed when Leonid Brezhnev took him to a hunting tower where they were waiting on boars to come in to feed, and then they would shoot them. Anyway, so in the privacy of this hunting tower, it was just Brezhnev, it was Kissinger, and it was the Soviet interpreter, Viktor Sukhadev. Brezhnev basically told him, you know what? I want to tell you something. We're not going to be taking notes. I want to tell you, you and you, the United States, and we, the Soviet Union, we will work together and we will run the world. Now, this message was paraphrased by Kissinger later when he recounted this episode to Nixon, but I like this title, to run the world, because I think it reflects Soviet ambition. The Soviets always had this ambition to be something greater than they are. They always had more ambition than they had the means for, and they craved to be up there next to the United States running the world. And that recognition by the United States as a partner in crime or the key adversary was actually central to their vision of themselves as a great power. Is that important to understanding Soviet foreign policy? I argue in the book, absolutely. And this is, by the way, something that connects the Cold War to the post-Cold War. Indeed, the book is very heavy on the psychological element. And I sometimes even tend to overlook issues that some of the other Cold War literature discusses, including, the basics of ideology and various other things, because I see this as secondary, supplementary, instrumental to this broader issue of being recognized as a great power, being recognized as leaders of a great power by the Soviet Union. And actually, some of the same logic applies also to the Chinese leaders. And those of you who read the book will find a lot there about the psychology of Chinese decision-making, in particular Mao Zedong. And I go into great detail to explain the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s with reference to this struggle for leadership between China and the Soviet Union. So this is then the main argument. But why did the book have to be so long? My dear commentators here don't need to be explained this, because they have themselves authored gigantic books. And of course, as historians, we face this dilemma. This book has almost 800 pages, right? And they're densely packed, and you can see that there's a lot on every page here. So this is going to be quite a read. Why is that? There's a specific reason for this, and begging forgiveness from my readers, I want to explain the rationale here. Basically, for many years, there was really very little that was appearing in the Russian archives. Why is that? For a variety of reasons. And things were kind of closed. Things were first opened in the early 1990s, as Christian, Svetlana, as Bill all know very well. They were opened up, and then they kind of closed down. And then in more recent years, things have really opened up in a major sort of way. And what used to be a trickle of documents turned into an absolute, running stream, just an ocean of documents. And by going into it, and I was trying to just dip my toes, but nearly drowned in it, because you had the papers of all Soviet leaders. They were super extensive. There were thousands of memoranda of conversations, letters, rants. My favorite category is Nikita Khrushchev's rants. We had, of course, we know that Nikita Khrushchev did not read all that much nor write all that much, but he liked to rant about various subjects, and his note takers would take down his various musings about a war and peace and everything under the heaven. And so all of these things are all of those things are now opened in the Russian archives for researchers. And I also had great luck with the Chinese archives. As Christian knows, those were quite open for a bit. And the Wilson Center was at the forefront of actually exploring this various collaborations with Chinese scholars, with the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and they did some great work in this. But then with the coming of President Xi Jinping, things really started to close down in Beijing. But I was very fortunate because I spent 4 years in China just at this cusp, just as the archives were actually opening up, before they actually were closed down. And I was able to get access to a lot of materials that scholars today are simply unable to access, which really highlights some core motivations of Chinese foreign policy. And you really allow us to go into great detail. So with all of this material, quantity turns into quality, and you are there with these people, the likes of Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Mao Zedong. You're there in a room with them, and they just rant for hours. They talk about their fears, they talk about their delusions, they talk about their ambitions, they talk about everything. Of course, you cannot answer to them, but you feel like you're a psychiatrist, and you really, after a while, after reading thousands and thousands of pages, you feel like you get to understand these people at a very deep, profound level, at a sort of level that cannot be understood by reading the newspaper like Pravda or the Chinese newspaper Renmin. You really understand these people, as individuals, and you really understand what drove them. And this is what I try to do. That's why this book reads a little bit like a psychiatric history of the Cold War, because I really go at a very deep level, individual level, to try to understand what drove those people. And guess what? It was not necessarily Marxism, Leninism. In many cases, you see that it's something else entirely. Their fear for their prestige, for example, their various insecurities, and so on and so forth. So that is what I try to do with this book: develop a new thesis, but also on the basis of new materials, retell the history of the Cold War. Because lo and behold, with the availability of these new materials, we can say something new almost about every Cold War crisis. We thought we knew everything, but of course we'll never know everything. But there's a lot new evidence in this book on anything you want to know, from the beginning of the Cold War to the Korean War, to the Chinese Civil War, to the Cuban Missile Crisis, to the Berlin Crisis, Yom Kippur War, you name it. Even Iran. Revolution in Iran, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, sort of Cold War in Africa. Of course, there are some things that never made it, and I was deeply hesitant to exclude some things on which I had huge quantities of documents, simply because Cambridge University Press was not going to publish it. I did propose to publish it in 3 volumes, which has been a precedent among some historians, but this was firmly rejected. So here we are, love it or hate it, but to run the world, it's here, and I look forward to the commentary and to questions.
Thank you, Sergey. We'll now have a chance to listen to one of this country's leading Russianists, Sovietologists, Professor William Taubman. He's the Bertrand Snell Professor of Political Science Emeritus at Amherst College. He received his A.B. in history from Harvard in 1962, a certificate from Columbia University's Russian Institute in 1965, and a PhD in public law and government from Columbia in 1969. He's the author of Khrushchev, The Man and His Era, published in 2003, which won the Pulitzer Prize for biography, and the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography. And he's the author of Gorbachev, His Life and Times, published in 2017, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. We're at the Wilson Center very proud to call him both a former Wilson Center Fellow, an alum of the institution, but also for many years, the chairman of the Cold War International History Project's advisory board. Bill, it's wonderful to have you back at the Wilson Center, at least at a Wilson Center Zoom conversation. And I'll turn the floor over to you for your comments and questions for Sergey.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be participating again in a Wilson project. And it's a pleasure to be talking about Sergey Radchenko's book. I have followed his trajectory throughout his career, known him for a long time. And I have three kinds of comments to make and three questions to pose. My first comment is that this book of his is, in my view, one of the very best accounts of Soviet foreign policy during the Cold War. It covers all of its dimensions. It touches on all areas of the world. It takes up all the major crises and some of the minor ones. And it zeroes in on what the Soviet Union sought and why in its relations with the United States on the one hand and China on the other, and then on the third, fourth, and fifth hands, other countries around the world. Secondly, I'd like to echo what Sergey himself just said about primary sources. The book is a magnificent achievement in finding, accessing, digesting sources in archives, a whole range of Russian archives. I've worked in some of them myself. Others, like Svetlana, have worked in them more than I have. But I think Sergey must be the champion. I can't imagine anyone doing more research than he has done. And then the Chinese archives, which he talked about. He lists 6 provincial archives, the archive of the Foreign Ministry. He's also worked in American, British, Indian, even Mongolian archives. And it's not just the quantity, but as he put it, it's the quality of what he was able to get in these archives. What he found and reports on is revealing, it's vivid, it's dramatic, it's personal. He brings the history of Soviet foreign policy and of the Cold War to life in a way that makes it more exciting for the reader. If any of you have read, as I suspect some of you have, his op-ed piece in the New York Times over the weekend, in which he talked about Sino-Russian relations, you could see even in that piece examples of his pulling things from the archives which brought his subject to life. Third, I wanted to take up what he describes as his radical new interpretation of the underlying motivations of Soviet foreign policy, namely, as he just described it to us, the Soviet search for legitimacy in the form of recognition of its superpower status, primarily by the West, especially by the United States, but also by the Chinese and also by the many other countries in the third world with which it has interacted. Of course, he recognizes the role of ideology, Marxist-Leninist ideology, the search for security, the creation of an empire, and the personal elements contributed by Soviet leaders or the impact of their character on their foreign policies. But his main theme is, as he said, this search for legitimacy. I have to admit that when I first focused on this, I was a little bit skeptical. I asked myself, what precisely does this additional dimension, as he describes it, add? For example, when he talks about the policies of Khrushchev and Brezhnev, seeking to ease the Cold War in a way that Brezhnev and the Americans described as détente, while at the same time extending Soviet power and influence in places around the world to which Stalin himself had not reached out in the Third World. I ask myself again, what do we gain by searching for recognition and legitimacy to these policies? What does it add? Well, having reacted skeptically and pondering this, I came to the conclusion that it adds something very important. And maybe the way I would put it is not the way he would put it, because I suppose you could say that every great power is interested in legitimacy and getting recognition. But what occurred to me, and I'd be curious later to get Sergey's reaction and Svetlana's and others, is this perhaps particularly applied to the Soviet Union, because in a sense, the Soviet Union and its leaders suffered from a kind of inferiority complex, deeper, broader than other powers, other superpowers. And in that sense, its search for recognition and legitimacy was indeed something different and something special. Now, let me go to my 3 questions. Actually, let's call it 4, because the first one is that very question to Sergey. Is it fair to say that the Soviet Union suffered from a especially deep inferiority complex? And if that is the case, what extra purchase do we get, in fact, in discussing particular cases and crises from recognizing its search for legitimacy and recognition? Second question.
Bill, why don't we, Bill, could we let Sergey respond to this?
Oh, okay.
And then go on with your next question. Yeah, like to keep it conversational. Sergey, go ahead and respond directly to this question, please. We can't hear you, Sergey.
Of course. This is, you get so excited that you forget about everything. And I was taking careful notes. And Bill, I thank you for your very kind comments about this book, and you know how much I value this. You raise an extremely important question, and there are 2 answers to this. And I hope I'm not going to open a can of worms, because when we touch on concepts like legitimacy, recognition, it's such a gigantic can of worms that we can talk for hours about it and potentially get completely lost in the discussion. But first of all, the first point to make is I completely agree with you. There was something special about the Soviet craving for recognition and for legitimacy through external recognition. And I think that comes from their realization that the kind of ideological framework that they used to legitimize their regime was not delivering, was starting to misfire, was having problems. And when did this come through? I guess you can name different dates, but certainly by the time that Brezhnev came into power, it became extremely obvious. Already by the late 1960s, it was clear that the Soviet Union was not delivering on its core promise to build communism and make everybody in the world happy. And therefore, it had really nothing else except to claim to be a great power and be legitimized as such externally by the United States. And of course, they didn't have elections, which is also a source of legitimacy for the regime. And so in the absence of this, you have to have external recognition. But it becomes even more complex there, because as I discuss in the book, sometimes there are different audiences that you seek recognition from, i.e., in the Soviet case, it was the United States was a key recognizer, but also they wanted recognition from China. They wanted to be recognized as leaders of the communist world. Hence, ideology comes back through the back door, because ideology is important for understanding what the communist world actually was. In any case, there are these different types of different audiences, and they require different kinds of behavior to be recognized as a great co-equal superpower with the United States, to a different kind of foreign policy than to be recognized as the leader of the revolutionary world. Hence the contradiction between different facets of Soviet foreign policy. They could never quite figure out whether they were with the hounds or with the hares. And so this is the first point that I wanted to make. And the second point related to this, you mentioned, Bill, and this is actually very, very very important. You mentioned that this craving for legitimacy and craving for recognition is not something peculiar to the Soviet Union. And indeed, you could say the same about any empire, any great power. And I would say, yes, absolutely. And in fact, I think by looking at this question from this perspective, we then see the Soviet Union as something not quite exceptional. In other words, as just one of those other great powers, and it makes it easier to contextualize the Soviet Union in the broader history of great powers, rise and fall of great powers, and indeed connect the Soviet past to Russia's present.
Thank you. Back to you, Bill. Bill, your microphone.
I'm going on to my next question. Before I do that, I just want to say that I would date this inferiority complex earlier than you did. I mean, you said you can see it particularly dramatically in the time of Brezhnev, but my God, you can see it in Khrushchev, for example, who is personification of a certain insecurity, which comes out in every bit of his dealing with the American leaders with whom he had contact. But my second question is, given this, accepting that this is a Soviet motivation, what kind of US policies do you think in retrospect were the best response and which were the least successful in recognizing and reacting to this kind of motivation?
Mm-hmm. So this one is super difficult because, of course, throughout the Cold War, you had also different American policies with regard to the Soviet Union, and you struggle with what policy would have been better. For example, it is now widely acknowledged by historians, as Bill, you would agree, that Stalin in the early post-war period was seeking some kind of a great power compromise and the sphere of influence, and perhaps was not as revolutionary as some people previously believed. And that is supported by the work of Norman Naimark, among others, but also by my own research in the archive. However, there's a problem, because if suppose at that time, the Americans were faced with a dilemma. What do you do about Soviet efforts to extend their influence in Eastern Europe? Would they assume at that time that Stalin's intentions were limited, or that they were unlimited, that his appetites were unlimited? Assuming that his intentions and appetites were limited, was dangerous in the sense that if it turned out that they were actually unlimited, then the price of making this mistake would have been Soviet domination of Europe. And let's be frank about it, we don't even know. I don't think Stalin even knew to the end what his actual goals were. Because, of course, as the French like to say, appetite comes during eating. And so the more he could get himself, the more he thought that he could further, extend himself. So there's an issue there. But by containing Soviet ambitions, the Americans inadvertently, perhaps, triggered a kind of Soviet reaction that brought about the Cold War. The Cold War, you might argue, was a high price to pay, but I think the price of getting Stalin, misreading Stalin, getting him wrong, would have been even higher. So in this sense, I don't see that a different policy would necessarily have led to a very different outcome early in the Cold War. Later on, however, and later on, let me give you a couple of more examples. And one with Khrushchev, which I think this is very close to you as well, and you will. I wonder whether you agree with this. But for example, there's a perception sometimes in some of the literature that in 1960 there was an opportunity to end the Cold War. There was obviously Khrushchev's visit to the United States in 1959, and that was supposed to be followed by the Paris summit, the four-power summit. And then what happened? Gary Powers was shut down over the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev got mad, and that led to the collapse of the whole Paris summit, and the Cold War continued. So what we learn now from the archival documentation is that Khrushchev himself realized in the run-up to Paris, in the run-up to May 1960, that he did not really have all that much to give away to the United States, and that real agreement on core issues of principle was actually quite out of reach. And so he actually welcomed the opportunity to ruin the summit, and felt that Gary Powers provided him with a very useful excuse. So all of that is to say that sometimes, you know, some of those things that we think, oh, better U.S. policy, for example, if only Eisenhower engaged with Khrushchev and begged forgiveness or something for Gary Powers, then things would have turned out completely differently. Well, it turns out it's actually much more complicated, because Khrushchev was under pressure, for example, by the Chinese to be tough with regard to the United States. However, all of this does not mean that American policies were always without consequence, and a better policy would not have worked. For example, one thing I found in the 1970s was that when President Carter pursued his policy with regard to promoting human rights in the Soviet Union, there was actually kind of a misunderstanding in the Carter administration about why the Soviets were very sensitive to this. Zbig Brzezinski at that time advised Carter that this was because they were so insecure about their own system. They understood that human rights was a big problem in the Soviet Union, and when the Americans talked about about human rights, or welcomed dissidents in the White House, or wrote letters to Soviet dissidents and so on and so forth, that this was this is something that the Soviets felt really insecure about. Now, if we look at this from the Soviet side, and I think Svetlana would know that, because we can see very interesting reflection of that also in the diary of Anatoly Chernyaev, which she translated, which can now be found on the website of the National Security Archive in English. It's a fantastic source, absolutely great source for this period. And Anatoly Chernyaev himself, although later, even the closet liberal at that time, and later obviously Gorbachev's key foreign policy aide at that time, fumed about Carter's lectures about human rights. Why is that? Because they resented being taught. They resented being spoken to from above, from a position of moral superiority, which is actually kind of ironic, because they always spoke to the Chinese from a position of moral superiority without understanding the Chinese were just driven. I mean, Mao Zedong was driven crazy by the Soviet tone and by the way that the Soviets tried to lecture to the Chinese. Well, when the Americans tried to lecture to the Soviets, the Soviet reaction was to push back, and it just created a lot of resentment. And the same thing happened, for example, in the 1970s with the whole story of Jewish immigration, which actually proceeded quite well in the early 1970s until the Americans really made a big issue in relations between the two powers, and then it was brought to an end. So in all of this, what we see is the Soviet hypersensitivity to slight, hypersensitivity to being lectured, and perhaps a more careful foreign policy would have resulted in better outcomes.
Christian, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, because I I pressed the wrong button, and I can see myself. I can't see the rest of you, but I'll quickly mention my third question, and that was, although Sergey says his book carries implications, and it does up to the present, I would have wished for more attention to Yeltsin and to Putin. So I wonder whether Sergey could talk a bit about his attitude toward the Soviet approach as exemplified by, well, let's say by Putin in particular, how that fits into his categories.
So that is a super interesting question. And of course, in the epilogue, I touch on both Yeltsin and on Putin, and I sort of speed through the 1990s into 2000s, and I find a lot of commonalities. In reality, many of the themes that drove Soviet foreign policy during the Cold War continued. This resentment of being looked down upon by the United States, this hope that the Americans will welcome Russia, new Russia, post-Soviet Russia, into the ranks of great powers and stand there together with Russia and together run the world. I mean, you have to wonder about this, because in the 1990s, Russia had even less of a claim on great power status than it did in the Soviet times, because there truly it was one of the two great superpowers. But in the 1990s, I guess Yeltsin, still for all the crisis, for all the problems experienced by the Soviet economy, for all the poverty, for all the despair, for all the lack of an idea, they were not even sure where they were going. He still felt that Russia was entitled to this role of a great power, partly because, of course, it was a nuclear weapon. It had nuclear weapons. It was a nuclear power, and that nuclear aspect, I think, really runs through the entire Cold War period and overruns and goes straight into the post-Cold War and into our times, because all other things being highly unequal, the Soviet Union did acquire in the late 1950s the ability to effectively destroy the United States. Brezhnev really put a lot. I mean, Khrushchev loved this, Bill, as you know. Khrushchev loved the bomb. He felt that it really gave him a trump card to negotiate outcomes, whether in Berlin or in Cuba and many other places. He used it. In the end, of course, he backed off from the brink, as we know, because he was so terrified of a nuclear war. Brezhnev thought that this was the great equalizer, and every time he talked about Soviet greatness, he talked about nuclear power and how the Soviets and the Americans had a special responsibility for the world because they could destroy the world. And that is where we see the effective death of Soviet ideology and the birth of this kind of ideology of peace that Brezhnev, Vlad Zubok also talks about it in his book. Brezhnev, the peacemaker. Brezhnev saw himself as this guy who will be remembered for bringing peace to the world. And of course, Gorbachev's claim to global relevance stems specifically from the realization the Soviet Union was a global nuclear power, and that had its very special responsibility alongside the United States for the fate of the world, holding the fate of the world in their hands, as Nixon once said. And we see the same thing in the 1990s and of course into 2000s. In the 1990s, with Yeltsin still hoping to be recognized by the United States as a key partner in many things, and feeling deeply resentful by about things like NATO enlargement. He told Clinton in May 1995 when the two met, when Clinton visited Moscow for the anniversary of the of victory in the Second World War. Yeltsin told him that we feel nothing but humiliation, and on the account of NATO enlargement and various things like that. They felt cut out of the Balkan solution, Dayton peace process, etc. The Soviets really thought, the Russians, I should not confuse this. The Russians felt really cut out. They felt that the Americans ignored them. And then, of course, came Kosovo, and they felt once again ignored. And then brings this comes all the way down to Putin, and Putin then is presented in this book as a guy who's trying to sort of avenge this humiliation, return Russia to greatness, because he feels American weakness in many ways, and he wants to be recognized. Now, the problem with Putin, we have early Putin and late Putin. Early Putin will seem to be a little bit more reasonable than obviously the vile imperialist late Putin, but in principle, the whole it's underpinned by the same idea of Russian greatness, Russia raising up, coming up from its knees, etc., etc. Only early on, Putin wanted to be recognized as American partner, i.e., in the war against terror and so on. And today, Putin, it seems to me, derives greater legitimacy from being recognized as America's key adversary. And that is an interesting aspect of recognition and legitimacy, because you can be recognized and legitimated as a great power, not just through recognition as a partner, but also as a recognition as a key adversary. In other words, when Obama talked about Putin as a kid in the back of the classroom and Russia as a power with waning regional influence, that is the kind of thing that would drive Putin crazy. Whereas now Russia is recognized as this, great enemy of Europe, great enemy of the West. Does that legitimate Putin? I think so. I think he derives real sense of legitimacy from being this great adversary of the West.
Thank you. Bill, if it's okay, I'd like to bring Svetlana into the conversation.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, and give her a turn at comments and questions for Sergey. Before I do that, let me remind our viewers that we want to hear from you, preferably by you using the raise hand function and queuing in line so we can call on you. You can already get in line. So press the raise hand function and we will call on you in a little bit. Or you can also post your questions to the Q&A, but that will come in secondly. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Svetlana Savranskaya. Dr. Savranskaya is the director of Russia programs at the National Security Archive, our good partners and friends over at George Washington University. She is the author with Thomas Blanton of the book, The Last Superpower Summits, Gorbachev, Reagan, and Bush, published in 2016, and editor of the book by the late Sergey Mikoyan, The Soviet-Cuban Missile Crisis, Castro, Mikoyan, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and the Missiles of November, published in 2012. Dr. Savranskaya won the Link Q Prize in 2011 from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, recognizing the best documentary publication over the previous 2 years for a book co-edited with Tom Blanton and Vladislav Zubok, Masterpieces of History, The Peaceful End of the Cold War in Europe, 1989. Svetlana is also a cherished member of the History and Public Policy Programs Advisory Board and a frequent contributor to all of our digital archive collections. She is a pioneer in making Russian and other archival materials available, and all of us owe her a great debt. I think, Bill, the one other person I would put up there in terms of archival access next to Svetlana and Sergey, of course, is Mark Kramer, whose name should be mentioned when we talk about this. But Svetlana, wonderful to have you here. Thank you. Welcome back to the Washington History program. We ask you a lot. I hesitate to ask you for this one, but as soon as I mentioned it, you said, yes, I'm in. So here we are. Svetlana, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian, for such a wonderful introduction. And I just want to say that I am here. I'm very happy to be here, and not so much because of the prestige that it gives me to be on the panel with Professor Taubman discussing the book by one of the really most important historians today, Sergey Radchenko. I am here because I was waiting for this book to come out. I read some chapters in the drafts and I liked them very much. And I could not wait to read the whole 700 pages of this book. And I just can say congratulations, Sergey, for producing this most important book, for an attempt to write a really comprehensive history of the Soviet foreign policy during the Cold War, but along with it, an attempt to write a comprehensive history of the Cold War. And I also would like to mention that I think that Sergey, in my experience, is the most sharing historian that I know. He constantly shares his documents. He tells people where he's working. And if you write to him and ask, well, Sergey, don't you have some documents about this? He most likely does. And he does not just sit on these documents. He makes them public and allows other people to use them. So I think that part of the reason that he wrote such a big book is that he saw all these riches. He saw all these archival documents. He found so much new information, and he really wanted to share everything. He wanted to give us so much detail that nobody has given to historians and interested people before. And like Bill already mentioned, here we have an example of truly unrivaled archival research. So many archival documents from so many countries. They're pulled together to show history not just from one perspective, but from the point of views and perspectives of different countries, of Vietnam and China and India and Iran. And I also really appreciate how Sergey gives us little stories, um, little episodes, which he describes in detail, of conversations between the leaders that make history come alive, like Bill already said, and give us a better understanding of the personality that makes those choices, makes those decisions. For example, for me, was very interesting to read the scenes of Khrushchev meeting with the Chinese and trying to not allow the Sino-Soviet relationship to slide into the abyss, and his sense of humiliation and his sense of insecurity even toward the Chinese. Um, I also loved the story of Brezhnev talking to Nixon about a possibility of a US-Soviet kind of mutual security treaty. Uh, First, he's talking to Nixon when Nixon is visiting him in Crimea. They're in the grotto, and Brezhnev says, well, basically, let's conclude an agreement where, if one of us is attacked or threatened, the other side will use its military forces to defend the person who was attacked. This is, I really have not read about it before. Maybe if I read, I did not feel so strongly how much it tells you about Brezhnev and Nixon. And of course, then the meeting with Kissinger, where Brezhnev produces the same idea, and he has this artillery toy in his hand, and he points at Kissinger. So these details are very valuable. I think they not just these details, but the case studies that Sergey presents in his book of major crises, minor crises, major countries, smaller countries. They fill in our understanding, our record of the Cold War, how it really was. So then I would like to talk about the new perspective, the new interpretation that Sergey offers. And I have to say, I was really intrigued about this for all these years, since the very first time I think Sergey told me that he was going to write this book and present this new interpretation, which takes prestige and recognition and the need for legitimacy as a major factor in international politics and in the Cold War. Now, as we just discussed, as Sergey just talked about the 1990s and even today, it's not just unique to the Cold War. And here I would like to be a little more skeptical. Now, Sergey, of course, says that the security and ideology reasoning factors are very important. But in many cases, especially in his conclusions to every chapter, he says that behind the rhetoric of security and ideology, one can always see powerful considerations of prestige, reputation, and the need for external legitimacy. He also mentioned internal legitimacy, but he mainly focuses on external legitimacy. And there are two types of legitimacy that he points to. One is the legitimacy as a superpower, in the Soviet case, as being recognized as being equal to the United States, and therefore having the right to do the same things that the United States does. And the other type of legitimacy is the legitimacy as the revolutionary, the global revolutionary leader, offering a different model of modernity, a future communist society that would inevitably defeat capitalism. And he shows that in particular case studies that these visions almost always clashed, and basically they were essentially irreconcilable. You know, if you want to be equal to the United States and recognized as a great power and have a condominium with the United States, you can't quite at the same time expect to be free to do in the third world whatever you want to do as the leader of the revolutionary movement. So here that gave me a little pause, and I thought, okay, well, I do agree completely that leaders and just human beings normally have considerations of prestige and recognition, even in the setting of friends, in the setting of professional, colleagues. There's always a consideration of prestige and recognition. And like Sergey pointed out, these very, very similar considerations are visible in the 1990s, in Yeltsin's foreign policy and in Putin's foreign policy. So in a way, you can say that, based on his argument, prestige and the need for recognition explains the motivation almost always, or it is a very powerful explanatory variable for the Soviet motivation throughout the Cold War. And even more, Sergei says many times in his book that actually the Soviets weren't that exceptional in that, because the United States were guided by the same logic. So on the other side, we also have the prestige and need for recognition as the explanatory variable. And if prestige explains many different outcomes, then my question is, how is it helpful? Like if you explain, for example, the placement of missiles in Cuba by considerations of prestige, both superpower and the revolutionary prestige, how then do you explain things like Gorbachev's unwillingness to use force in Eastern Europe during 1989, right? Then you can also say, well, it's also prestige and recognition, but his definition of prestige and recognition, the kind of recognition he wanted, was different. Then the question is, if prestige is always important, and we're aware that it is important, it's important in making decisions to kind of anticipate that the other side would be concerned about prestige. But it seems like still a better explanation of particular decisions is to give some analysis for individual leaders' perceptions, their ideas, their fears, their security concerns, and kind of the context, the situation, what the international system throws at them. Because the outcome is different in every case that you discuss, and we know that prestige is behind as part of the motivation. So then if the variable does not vary, what is the power, how really helpful it is to know that prestige was one of the most important motivations if the outcomes are different. So next time you see, Putin doing something, you say, oh, we know that prestige would be very important in his decision, but you can't say, and based on that, we think it would go this way or that way. So this is my first question. And what I see in the book is that sometimes when Sergei describes the actual interactions between the leaders, he does describe the fears and the ideas and how they clashed and how opportunistic they were and how the outcomes comes from this interaction. But then in the conclusion, he concludes that even though security concerns were present and ideology was important, it's still prestige in the end. So my first question, as an explanatory variable, how useful is prestige?
Thank you, Svetlana. I did not expect anything less from you than to really drive into the heart of the book, which I think you did very, very successfully. And thank you for that, because it really it is a core question, and one thing that I do want to do is I don't want to oversimplify the argument. In fact, in the introduction, I try to reflect on some of these things and concepts, what I say there is that many of these concepts, including ideology, including security, are very vague. They overlap. There's a great confusion among them. So, for example, you might say that a key motivation for the Soviet Union was the pursuit of, let's say, ideology, i.e., communist revolution. And the reason it needed to pursue the reason it needed to secure itself against external enemies is because it wanted to pursue communist revolution, right? Or you can take it, you can flip it on its head, and you can say, well, actually, the real care for the Soviet leaders was the pursuit of security. But since in their minds, whoever had communists, if they had communist allies that would actually be useful to their security, therefore by pursuing communist revolution, they were pursuing actually their security interests. You see, this is overlapping, and it's completely ridiculous, because we have this crazy debates for decades among historians, whether it was ideology, whether it was security. When you actually drill into it, you realize that a lot of these concepts actually overlap. And in the end, since we know how human beings generally function, it's very difficult to ascribe a particular motive. So as historians, we like to take refuge in multi-causality and say, well, it was everything. It's just everything. It's security, it's ideology, it's God knows what else, prestige, striving for recognition. All of these things are coming together. And this is, this explains foreign policy, or maybe doesn't explain, because if you put everything together and then nothing actually works. So that's why I think in my book, I try to emphasize this particular notion of striving for recognition, because I think it is analytically kind of distinct, and it's sort of new in its own way, and it allows us then to reflect on some Soviet decisions from a different perspective, rather than from the familiar duality of security versus revolutionary interests. And I'll explain, and I'll show you in a couple of examples where this nuance actually makes a difference. So, for example, you mentioned Cuba. In Cuba, the usual duality, and I know where you stand in this debate very well, of course, from our long interaction, from reading your work. The usual duality goes something like that. Khrushchev decided to send missiles to Cuba because either he felt that the Soviet forces were strategically inferior, therefore he had to get there in order to threaten the United States, i.e., this is strategic rationale for his decision making. Or the second reason that, of course, was most prominently advanced by Sergey Radchenko, and in your book with Sergey Radchenko, it's also explained quite very well. It's this idea of revolutionary obligation, revolutionary duty. That is to say, Cuba was going to be invaded by the United States, and it had to be saved from American invasion, and therefore it was all about saving Cuba. So this is a very familiar argument, right? On the strategic arguments, Khrushchev, the strategic calculating, what do you call it? Strategist. On the other hand, you have Khrushchev, the revolutionary, the last revolutionary. Where do I come down on this? With regard to the strategic argument, I argue in a relevant chapter on Cuba that actually Khrushchev, because he never wanted to fight a nuclear war, he didn't actually think in those terms. Do we have the platform to threaten the United States? This will allow us to solve the Berlin problem, or whatever, something like that. He never thought in those terms. What he did, and we can see in his various rants and his complaints about this, what he did see is he felt a sense of inequality vis-a-vis the United States, in particular with regard to missiles in Turkey. So he would talk about missiles in Turkey and say, oh, look at those missiles in Turkey, look at what they're doing. They're turning Turkey into base against us, and we're not allowed to do that, and that's not fair. What is going on? So this sense of being, this resentment of being kind of dictated to and being surrounded by American bases is what, in part, what drove Khrushchev's decision. So you can see how this particular resentment in this case impacted policy, which is it then becomes important to identify it as a specific separate category from the other categories. Now, with regard to this question of saving Cuba, I recognize in the book that actually saving Cuba was an important reason, and we cannot avoid this argument because he talked about it in the Politburo before the Presidium, before sending missiles to Cuba as the decision was being made, and then later when we had the actual discussions at the Presidium during the crisis itself in October 1962. Again, he raised this issue of having, of sending missiles to Cuba in order to protect Cuba. So clearly, the idea of protecting Cuba was an important motivation. But what I ask in the book is, why is it that he cared about it so much? Why is it that he cared about protecting Cuba? And the argument that I make is that he connected in this question in his mind with the question of China, and he worried that losing Cuba would be such a blow to Soviet prestige that the Chinese would take advantage of this. And of course, as we know, as Svetlana, you know more than anybody else, in the aftermath of this crisis, the one thing that he did was he was just concerned about China all the time. He was complaining to the Cubans about China. Oh, don't listen to the Chinese. They are not. What are they doing? These people don't understand the whole situation, etc. Listen to us. So he was really deeply hurt. So in this sense, you can see kind of Khrushchev's motivations and logic. And I think by introducing this additional motivations, I help explain his decision-making process a little bit better. Now, in the introduction, I really go out on a limb and I bring in Maslow and they say, well, remember the pyramid of human needs. By the way, it has been criticized, psychologists here in the room will just laugh me out of the room because, this whole theory that Maslow put forward about hierarchy of human needs has been criticized as completely irrelevant, etc., because of the whole issue of hierarchy, that it doesn't actually work very well with empirical observations. But it doesn't matter. So I take this notion and I say, well, okay, so what were the needs of the Soviet Union? Security is clearly there, and that would even put it at the basis of the pyramid. Say, look, security was definitely there. You couldn't get very far without security. It's clearly an issue. And then as you try to build on this, issues like legitimacy, self-actualization as this revolutionary power, as an equal of the United States, all of these things kind of are built up from this basis of security. I don't know if that's one way of looking at it. I know it's a kind of a dangerous way when you bring analogies from parallel sciences into history. I think that may be a dangerous proposition, but I certainly do that. I go out on a limb. So does it explain change? And that is the big question. If it was always the same, then why is it so different? Well, my argument is, if it was always so different, why does it always end up the same? Effectively, so that is it's sort of two sides of the same coin. Again, with regard to Gorbachev, and I recognize that this is probably the most controversial part of the book, and I know both you and Bill are so well qualified to really tear it to pieces. There are several chapters in Gorbachev there where I really kind of go deep into this and try to understand what Gorbachev's motivations were, and particularly in Eastern Europe, and identify a number of motivations, including, it seems to me, the core motivation is actually economic, so it has nothing to do with recognition or anything else. He basically was he knew that he couldn't keep the whole Soviet project, the socialist project, going. He would have to pay for it in Eastern Europe, and he knew that he didn't have the money to do it. Now, there are other motivations that have been cited, including aversion to use force. We know about that. I mentioned that, by the way, aversion to use force in the book. But I also mentioned this other motivation of being recognized as the guy who kind of ended the Cold War, and we know that it was super important for Gorbachev. So in the end, I explain change by effectively arguing that that people want to be recognized for different things, and that's a fair starting point, really. Brezhnev wanted to be recognized as the peacemaker, and that explains a lot of his policy with regard to Nixon, with regard to the tone. Gorbachev wanted to be recognized as the guy who ended the Cold War and who embraced, human values, etc. But he still had his resentments because he felt the Americans were not giving him the proper recognition that he deserved. And there we get to the Malta summit that I really recount in great detail, and that Svetlana, so much about, because you have written extensively about it. So I go into the records of Malta summit and really try to portray here Gorbachev's show the frustrated Gorbachev talking to Bush, feeling that he was being unrecognized, that Bush thought that he was winning the Cold War, whereas in reality, no, it was not it was the Cold War. There was the Soviet Union that, or how does he put it? The Cold War itself was losing. The whole concept of the Cold War was losing. So it's all kind of really interesting when it comes down to the psychiatric, analysis. I'm not a very good psychiatrist sometimes, it seems, but I try to bring out those motivations in every time just try to explain specific decisions with reference to specific maybe fears, delusions, desires of each individual. And that makes the book a little bit complicated in this regard, because they're all, all kinds of spokes and hubs and various things and wires here and there. But in the end, I think this is, life is complicated. So we have to allow for this complexity. So I don't want to, as a final word, I don't want to dumb it down and say it's recognition and nothing else. Of course, it's much more than that.
Okay, I know that the other 200 participants in this webinar now hate me, but I will go really quickly through my comments or questions. You don't need to answer, but we might just talk about it later. So your title is To Run the World. But when you read your book carefully, then very often you say things that actually completely contradict it. You say repeatedly, there simply was no Soviet plan for southward expansion, no testament of Peter the Great to draw upon. The Soviets were often engaged in opportunistic behavior. You repeatedly show that the Soviets were constrained and wanted to show constraint. And your discussion of particular cases contradicts the idea that the Soviets had a plan to run the world. But somehow in the end, your very, very last words in your book, you say that with a combination of chutzpah and good luck, Russia could one day recover its elusive greatness and its unsatiable, self-destructive ambition to run the world. I don't think that your evidence supports your title. And the other thing, to run the world, how do we run the world? When you talk about Brezhnev's idea to run the world was to sit next to Nixon or any other American president to make sure there is peace, there is no war, to have the superpower condominium, and together look at every international crisis and resolve it on mutually beneficial terms. Well, if that's the case, that's exactly the vision that Gorbachev had.
That's exactly the point.
He wanted to sit next to Reagan and Bush and make sure there was peace and deep disarmament, nuclear abolition, and every third world conflict was solved. Same about Yeltsin. So the very last two words. I think the main contribution of your book, and this is for me, maybe I'm just ignorant of that, but I think your description of the Chinese factor was just absolutely amazing. I think people should read it and think about it, and you show it like nobody else. And the very last thing, after reading your book, I came to the conclusion, what I kind of saw in it, that maybe it was China who had the grand strategy and wanted to run the world and not the Soviets. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for taking too much time.
No, thank you, Svetlana. Those are really Christian. Did you want me to because there is an important, very super important issue that I wanted to raise. I think prompted by Svetlana's very insightful comment here.
Sure, but really briefly, Sergey, because I do want to get to at least to a couple of questions. You've taken long answers. Make this one really succinct.
Oh, that's okay. That's going to be hard. The question of Brezhnev and Gorbachev, they at one level they wanted to run the world together with the United States, in partnership with the United States. That's what Brezhnev wanted to do during the Tone. That's what Gorbachev wanted to do during the Perestroika. But there's a problem, and the problem is because there's a competition still between those two powers. At every opportunity that they got, almost at every opportunity, they would be tempted to stab the United States in the back. It's not the Soviets were so bad. The Americans would do the same thing. I mean, Kissinger stabbed them in the back like crazy in the Middle East. The Soviets would also do the same thing when they had an opportunity. So this whole idea of running the world as a condominium together with the United States, it was really deeply unstable, which is why the Tone fell apart. And I talk about it. And the same with regard to Gorbachev. You think, well, Gorbachev, he just wanted to be a partner of the United States. But then when you read his interactions with the Chinese, you realize that actually he was also kind of plotting with the Chinese to create a triangle with India and oppose that to the United States. And you think, well, you know, there's more to this than meets the eye. Gorbachev comes across as a politician. I'm sure this is not a huge revelation for you or Bill, who's written a fantastic biography. But anyway, so this is all to say that to run the world does not necessarily mean to run the entire world by themselves. It also could include an element of kind of a joint co-running the world. But there's a problem. There's a nuance there.
Great. Thank you, Sergey, for answering that one succinctly. And thank you, Svetlana and Bill, for really thoughtful and provocative questions. Let us turn to our audience now. I'll first call on Hope Harrison. If you could please unmute yourself. Hope.
Thank you so much. Sergey, it's so wonderful to hear you talk about your book. I can't wait to read it. So your talk about the search for legitimacy, that was certainly in my first book on the Berlin Wall. That's exactly what I felt was going on with all of Khrushchev's negotiations with the West, wanting and putting off Ulbricht, putting off closing the border because he was kind of getting more satisfaction from feeling a broader sense of legitimacy from negotiating with the West. So, you know, your overall argument is something that resonates very well with me. I'm just wondering if, you know, there's anything particularly big and new you want to share about the Berlin crisis surrounding the building of the wall.
Thank you. Christian, should I go ahead? Or were you
Yeah,
going to
please.
Okay,
nope, go ahead.
It's great to hear you, and indeed, as you'll see in the book, I did draw on your book, Driving the Soviets Up the Wall, extensively in my account of the Berlin crisis. I did have some new things to say, and one thing that fascinated me during the Berlin crisis is the story that about Nikolai Vashugin, which it never comes up in any kind of context. Who was Nikolai Vashugin? Nikolai Vashugin was a commander in one of the Soviet army commanders during the German invasion of the USSR. And at that time, Khrushchev was in Ukraine, so he comes over to Ukraine. It was just in the immediate weeks after the Soviet invasion, or rather the German invasion of the Soviet Union. And he basically tells Khrushchev that he had lost a tank army. And Khrushchev says, well, what is to be done? And Nikolai Vashugin pulls out a gun and blows his brains out in front of Khrushchev. And that's a bit of, you'd think of it as a kind of dramatic story. But what's interesting is that Khrushchev recounts the story at the heart of the Berlin crisis, i.e., as we kind of go up to the build up to the Berlin Wall. We have Khrushchev recounting this crisis in the context of his discussion of a possibility of war with the United States. Of course, we know that Khrushchev estimated this war, the possibility of war, being 5%. When he discussed that at the Presidium, there were some voices who said, "Well, maybe maybe it's 10% or something like that." Khrushchev thought it was 5%. But then when push came to shove, he backed off, right? He backed off precisely because he could not count on the rationality of human beings in this conflict. And he compared Kennedy to Vashugin. He said, what if Kennedy, it's clear that Americans they should not exchange Berlin for Washington, but what if they do? What happens if they do? And having witnessed this kind of story, but I think in the end he almost put himself in Vashugin's shoes, because he himself could not take the seemingly irrational step towards trying to push the Americans out of West Berlin. And so in the end he opted for a less dangerous measure. As we know, we kept postponing the whole business of the ultimatum. So for me, this is very important because it shows how personal experience in the Second World War, even though Khrushchev witnessed all kinds of horrible things, his son died, etc., how that impacted on his psychology during key crises, including Berlin and Cuba. I think that's something that is useful to discuss in this context.
Thank you. There's someone called James Hirschberg who's been patiently waiting to ask his question. Jim, over to you, and a short question, please.
Thank you very much, Christian. This wonderful event clearly needed to be more than 2 hours long, let alone an hour and a half. I'm delighted to be with such wonderful friends and colleagues, but I will be as brief as I can. First of all, for Sergey, I'm thrilled about the book, eager to read it again and to assign it. Regarding your thesis that recognition, prestige, and legitimacy were more important than heretofore realized in Soviet motivations, I would like to go back to Stalin and ask you, regarding a subject you've studied well, regarding Stalin's decision to build the atomic bomb as fast as possible, regardless of the destruction of the Soviet economy and polity by Germany, as a result of World War II. How much do you now believe his decision was motivated by considerations of prestige, legitimacy, and recognition, as opposed to the usual explanation, which stresses considerations of security and countering the threat of the United States atomic monopoly? And secondly, of all the many thousands of documents that you have read from your archival spelunking, what is your absolute favorite and why? Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Sergey.
Jim, we can talk about it for hours, as you say. On Stalin, yes, on Stalin, very quick. The second question is the one we can talk for hours. The Stalin and the bomb question, I think, is reasonably easy to answer. We know that Stalin was not necessarily impressed by the bomb's destructiveness. He had sent a team to Japan to investigate this. The report that he received suggested that perhaps it was manageable, but still he put all of his resources into the building of the bomb. And even before he actually, we know that the key decision was taken in August 1945, but even before, indeed, by appointing Beatty as the head of the atomic project, he effectively highlighted the core importance of this to the Soviets. Why is this? I think it is because he valued the bomb as an element of as a part of the psychological pressure that the United States would now exert on the Soviet Union, and we could see how he was intimidated during the London Conference of Foreign Ministers. In the book, of course, I spend a lot of time talking about that, building somewhat on the famous Pechatnov paper that was published years and years ago. But of course, I had the access to all the original materials and really scrutinized the cables between Stalin and Molotov, in which, remember, Stalin was telling Molotov, you cannot, the Allies are pressing on you to yield, but you should display absolute, resistance to all of their demands. If you read into all of those cables, you can see what Stalin was really concerned about. He was concerned about being not outvoted, what's the right word, being sort of in the minority, and he especially resented being one against four in this context, with the other powers turning against him, including China. And he felt that the atomic bomb was the kind of a trump card that allowed the Americans to really push with force against the Soviets, and he resolved to push back against this with absolute display of complete defiance, refusing to make any concessions and so on and so forth, because he feared that if he just made a small concession, the Americans would decide that this was because of the atomic pressure. So that is all very interesting, and I talk about it in the book. Now, with regard to my favorite, my absolute favorite document. Oh, Christian?
How about this, Sergey? How about you think about that for a moment? We'll call on a couple more questions, and at the very end, you'll get to say the one favorite document of the entire book. Yeah. All right. Let's call on Anita Parlow. Anita Parlow, your question, please, and a succinct question, please.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I'm pretty honored to be part of, to be able to listen to such brilliance, and I certainly look forward to reading the book. And my question is regarding using your knowledge of historical facts and bringing in the issues of prestige and security and perhaps even financial incentives, looking at the Arctic, where Russia certainly has dominance and continues to grow its dominance, and relating to some extent to China, and sort of fighting its hybrid war, one may say hybrid threats. How do you look at, and not perhaps looking to outshine the West and the United States, actually indeed so, and perhaps looking to bar NATO from maritime Arctic? How do you look at the dynamics as they play themselves out today from a context of historical reference? Thank you.
Thank you. Quick answer, Sergey, please.
So on the Arctic, I don't really talk about it in the book all that much because it is, I see it as a secondary, obviously there are lots of topics that I do not touch upon. I would just draw your attention, Anita, if you have not seen Christina Spore's new direction. Christina Spore has been working on the Arctic during the Cold War, and I look forward to reading the outcome of this, because I think there is a lot that we can learn from this. And of course, the Arctic is becoming much more important to Russian foreign policy today, and its presence in the Arctic is seen as one of the great attributes that makes it a great power. But we don't really see it so much during the Soviet period. I think it is because in our collective imagination, the Arctic has become much more important, partly as a result of climate change. Now, the Soviets, of course, it was important for the Soviets mainly for strategic reasons and for kind of military reasons, but not for great power reasons, not quite like it is today.
Thank you. John Lyle, last question. John Lyle, last short question.
Yes, the reason I asked for a question was Austria. I was alive when the Soviets pulled out of Austria, and it was a period of great tension with us. I never understood their motivation, and I would like to hear Sergey say what his research might say on that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sergey?
Thank you, John. And again, I think the time is quite limited. 1955, you're talking about the Austrian Treaty. And everything that came out of this. Well, I mean, I do talk about this period in my book, and particularly I focus on the German question, less on the Austrian question than on the German question. Now, that is something that Mark Kramer has also explored in his work, in particular, to what extent were the Soviets interested in potentially solving, quote unquote, solving the German problem in sort of after Stalin's death. And what I found is really interesting. In 1953, there there was indeed almost a momentum in the Soviet leadership to try to actually attain a neutral Germany. And that fell apart for a variety of reasons that I discuss in my book, that are probably too complicated to go into detail here, but still some desire to limit the Cold War continued, and so you have then the Austrian negotiations and so forth, and so forth. And I think that actually goes back to Svetlana's very important point. What did they want to do in the end? When at different points in the Cold War, like when the Soviets inherited, when Stalin died and Nikita Khrushchev and others came to power, what did they still want to run the world, or did they want actually to retrench a little bit? And the answer, I think, is actually quite complicated. Of course, they still sought American recognition, and perhaps they felt that they could attain it by achieving compromise in particular areas, including Austria and Germany. But all of that started to really fall apart as a result of Khrushchev really getting the taste of atomic weapons, which happened sort of around the same time.
Thank you. Sergey, final question. Your favorite document that you found in the archives that's perhaps in your book?
I have to say that, Jim, as you know, one of the best reasons to go to the Russian, and by the way, I don't recommend anybody go there now. I cannot go there now. I think it's a recipe of being taken hostage or something by the Russian government.
Yeah. Sergey, what's the document?
The document is the Russian versions of conversations with Nixon that do not exist in the American archives. Why is that? Because Brezhnev would always wait for Kissinger to leave the room, because he felt that Kissinger was a bad influence in Nixon. So he would wait until Kissinger left the room to really discuss important questions with Nixon. And I would love to go into detail, but it's in the book, so find out. It's really great stuff.
Great. Super. Thank you, Sergey. Wonderful talk. Thank you. Thank you, Svetlana. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Eric, for really rich discussion of Sergey's marvelous book. Sergey, congratulations. I'll turn it over with apologies to those we could not call on. I'll turn it back over to Eric for final words. Eric?
The tyranny of our Zoom schedule. My thanks to everyone as well. And remember, our next and final session of the Washington History Seminar will take place on Tuesday, June 11th from 9:30 to 11 a.m. Eastern Time, when we meet in person at the Wilson Center for a discussion of Chen Jian's Zhou Enlai, A Life, a session that will also be viewable online. Till then, take care, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon.